Technically, the word tense refers to the time frame in which actions take place, present, past, or future. And some of you may be familiar with the idea that in Spanish, the two past tenses, imperfect and preterite, differ in terms of aspect, whether the action referred to is completed or in progress. And that in Spanish, verbs can be conjugated to reflect various moods, such as the indicative, the subjunctive, and the imperative moods. But in this presentation, I'll be using the word tense in the broad sense in which most language learners understand it. This simply means that I'll be referring to classifications such as the preterite, the present subjunctive, and the imperfect progressive, all as different verb tenses. So, for the purposes of this presentation, this lesson, verb tense or tenses refer to distinct groupings of verb forms that share common stems and endings, refer to the same time frames, and have the same uses and functions. I know this is review for a lot of people, but just bear with me. It might not be for everybody. In Spanish, there are three classes of verbs. We have verbs that end in AR, verbs ending in ER, and verbs that end in IR. Technically, these three classes are called the first, second, and third conjugations. But to avoid confusion, I usually refer to them as verb classes or simply as AR, ER, and IR verbs. In most tenses, the endings we add when we conjugate verb forms will differ slightly for each verb class, as you'll be able to see when we look at the conjugation charts for the various tenses on the slides. This slide shows some common examples of unconjugated verbs or infinitive forms for each of the three verb classes. What most people call verb conjugation refers to how specific individual verb forms are generated for each tense. When we conjugate a verb in a particular tense, we start with a stem that's used as the basis for all forms in that tense, and then we add endings that are different for every tense and that vary by subject and verb class. Now, these endings signal who or what is associated with the action, what the subject is, the time frame of that action, and other information relevant to its functioning and range of meanings. To provide a simple illustration, what we see on this slide is how various stems and endings are used to conjugate the regular AR verb hablar in the first person singular or yo form in three different tenses. Notice that two of the forms have written accents toward the end, which indicate which syllable, which vowel we stress when we pronounce the form. If there's no written accent, we stress the second to last vowel as in the first form. So we will have hablo, but the second and third forms, hablé and hablaría. Since the endings we use when we conjugate vary depending on who or what is associated with the action, the subject, it's probably a good idea for us to review quickly the subject positions and pronouns in Spanish. This chart organizes them according to the categories of course, number, whether they're singular, plural, person, first, second, or third person, and you can also see some markers for gender there. For example, you can see there's a difference between the masculine and feminine forms of nosotros, nosotras, vosotros, vosotras. We have él, ella, ellos, ellas, etc. Okay. You can also see here that we are showing the familiar and formal second person singular pronouns, tú and usted, right? Tú is the familiar form. Usted is the formal or polite form of second person singular address, as well as the distinction between vosotros and ustedes, which both mean you guys or you all, right? Keep in mind, of course, that the vosotros pronoun and all vosotros verb forms are used only in Spain. You will rarely or never hear or see a vosotros form in Latin American dialects where they use ustedes exclusively. So I just wanted to review this organization, the idea of number, gender, and person. I'm going to use the same type of chart as I present the verb conjugations for the different tenses to follow. Now, what we see on this slide really is an overview, sort of a bird's eye view of the system, the structure of Spanish verb tenses, how they relate to one another, whether they're simple tenses, compound tenses, what mood they are in terms of indicative or subjunctive. Now, the second column to the right has the 7 simple tenses: present, imperfect, preterite, future conditional, present subjunctive, and imperfect subjunctive. Simple because their conjugated forms consist of a single word. Right next to that, we have the perfect tenses, in which we have the conjugated form consisting of two parts, right? The verb haber, which can be conjugated to reflect different time frames, and which is combined with the hado or ido, the past participles, okay? And then finally, in that final column to the right, we have the progressive tenses, which use as their auxiliary verb estar, conjugate estar in different tenses. Here I have the present perfect and the imperfect tenses, or progressives, and that is combined with the present participle, or the progressive form, which ends in ando and yendo. Okay? Now, another column could be added to the chart, since technically it's possible to combine the perfect and progressive tenses to say, for example, that somebody has been doing something, had been doing something, or would have been doing something, etc. You'll also notice that I've left some cells on the chart blank, not because those tenses don't exist, they do, but because they're fairly rare and can almost always be avoided by using simpler forms of expression, easier tenses. So, what we're left with are 15 relatively common tenses that can be used to get any idea across in Spanish. One more thing. You'll notice that the chart groups the tenses as correlating to the indicative or subjunctive moods. I'll be providing examples of the forms and uses of the subjunctive tenses in a moment, but this lesson will not include a detailed explanation as to when to use the subjunctive versus the indicative moods. That's a topic for a whole other video lesson altogether. Okay, now here's a variation on that previous chart that I think can be helpful, because some people find the names of the tenses, conditional, present perfect, imperfect progressive, etc., sort of distracting and confusing. They prefer examples or some other way to associate the different forms with their functions. So what I've done on this slide is to replace the names of the tenses with examples of conjugated forms and their English equivalents. So I've used a regular AR verb, right, hablar, to speak, as the example form. I've gone ahead and conjugated each cell in the first person singular, yo, or I form. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Feel free to pause the video here if you want to take a longer look, and remember, you can always refer back to this slide whenever you need to. Let's take a moment to break down this slide a little, since I'll be using the same format for each of the next simple tenses as well. I'll use the same three verbs, hablar, comer, and vivir, to speak, to eat, and to live, as examples of how to generate the forms for each tense. These are common regular verbs, so they're good model verbs in terms of memorizing the forms. I'll try to work in some more verbs, right, more variety into the rotation as I give examples of usage. Also, each slide to come clearly will show the stems and endings that are combined to generate the correct forms. You'll be able to see this because they'll be in different colors, as you can see on this slide. So that will help you to be able to differentiate between where the stem ends and where the endings begin. And a final thing to keep in mind is the reminder about pronunciation. When we actually say these verb forms, we stress the second to last vowel unless the form has a written accent, right? Obviously, if the form has a written accent, we're going to stress the vowel that's accented instead. So let's talk about this slide. We're looking at the present tense, right? You can see that the ER and IR verbs have similar endings. The only difference is in the nosotros and vosotros positions. Okay, now on the next slide, I've provided some examples of uses of the present tense. Okay, we have Felipe habla inglés, Felipe speaks French. Ellas tocan el piano, which could be they play the piano or even they are playing the piano. No corremos los domingos, we don't run on Sundays. Juan y Raúl venden coches usados. So basically the present tense is used to talk about what people habitually, customarily, usually do. Also what someone's doing right now, or to make general statements about conditions or actions. Alright, and moving on then to our first of the two simple past tenses in Spanish, the imperfect. We can see the forms on this slide. We have hablaba, hablabas, hablaba, etc., as opposed to the ER, IR forms which have exactly the same endings across the different subject positions. Comía, vivía, comías, vivías, comía, vivías, etc. It's important that when you pronounce these ER, IR forms that you stress that E. Comías, vivía, vivían, comíais, etc. Okay? Now let's take a look at some examples of usage in the imperfect. Yo estudiaba mucho. I used to study a lot. Ella miraba televisión mientras cocinaba. She watched TV as she cooked. Tú siempre me prometías eso. Tú siempre me prometías eso. You always promised me that, or you would always promise me that. Nosotros vivíamos en Los Ángeles. Nosotros vivíamos en Los Ángeles. We used to live in LA. So you can see from these examples that we're using the imperfect to refer to activities in the past that are either ongoing, recurring, background information, this type of thing. Sort of corresponds to the English phrases used to, would always, or to say that somebody was or were, that people were doing things in the past. The emphasis is on the incompleted or the in progress, ongoing nature of the verb in question. All right, here we see the second of the simple past tenses in Spanish, the preterite or pretérito. You can see that the forms, the endings for the ER and IR verbs are exactly the same. They're identical, but the AR verb endings are a little bit different. Okay. In terms of uses, let's take a look at these examples. Ana envió la carta ayer. She sent the letter yesterday. ¿Dónde comiste esa noche? Where did you guys eat last night? ¿No recibiste el regalo? ¿No recibiste el regalo que te mandé? ¿No recibiste el regalo que te mandé? You didn't receive the present I sent you? Los niños no abrieron la ventana. Los niños no abrieron la ventana. Again, those forms are on the previous slide if you want to verify. The kids didn't open the window. You can see then from these examples that we're using the preterite as opposed to the imperfect to narrate actions or to say that an action was or was not completed in the past. These are the forms for the future tense, the simple future tense in Spanish. One thing to point out, or a couple things to point out. First of all, the stem for the future is the entire infinitive. So we start with hablar, comer, vivir, or whatever the verb is, and then add the endings. A second thing to point out is that the endings are identical regardless of whether the verb is AR, ER, or IR. And then finally, we should note that there is an alternative or an alternate form for talking about the future, and that is to take the verb ir, to go, add a, and then the infinitive, just like we would in English when we say, I'm going to study, we're going to play soccer later on, are you going to call me today? Voy a estudiar, vamos a jugar al fútbol más tarde, vas a llamarme hoy? So that alternate form is probably even more common than using the simple future tense in Spanish. Let's take a look at some of the examples of usage. All right, first, hablaré contigo en un momento. Hablaré contigo en un momento. I will speak with you in a moment. Ellos venderán su casa antes de mudarse. Ellos venderán su casa antes de mudarse. They will sell their house before moving. ¿A qué escuela asistiremos en San José? ¿A qué escuela asistiremos en San José? So what school will we attend in San Jose? Nothing confusing or mysterious about this tense. It's just used to express what people will do in the future. Okay, as with the future, with the conditional, which is used to say what people would do, we have the same couple of things to point out. First, we use the entire stem, or the entire infinitive, I should say, as the stem, hablar, comer, vivir, or whatever the verb is, and then we add the endings, which, second thing to point out, are the same for AR, ER, and IR verbs. And maybe a third thing to point out is that these endings are the same as the ER, IR endings in the imperfect, right? That IA, IAS, IA ending. Now, in terms of examples of use, let's take a quick look. Yo que tú no compraría esa camisa, meaning, if I were you, I would not buy that shirt. ¿Usted me escribiría una carta de recomendación? ¿Usted me escribiría una carta de recomendación? Would you write me a letter of recommendation? And finally, ellos aprenderían español si tuvieran tiempo. Ellos aprenderían español si tuvieran tiempo. They would learn Spanish if they had time. A couple things to point out with the uses then. Of course, the conditional is the tense we use when we want to say what people would do, could do, should do, mostly would, right? But in that final example, they would learn Spanish if they had more time. We're using the conditional in the then clause, right? In the then clause of an if-then statement that's about the present, but expresses the if clause is something that's contrary to fact or hypothetical. If they had time, which they don't, they would learn Spanish. That part, the then clause, they would learn, is in the conditional. So it's a combination of the conditional and the past subjunctive, which we'll get to in a moment. And here we have the first appearance of a subjunctive tense. Okay, like I said before, not going to go into a huge amount of detail in terms of when or why we use the subjunctive. Let's focus on the forms here, right? One thing to point out that might be obvious is that you have something curious going on here. The AR verbs seem to have endings that would be more suited to an ER, IR type of verb, whereas the ER and IR verbs have sort of those same opposite vowel types of endings, right? Instead of come or como, it's coma, comas, or instead of vive, vives, we have vivas, viva. So that's how we get the forms, and I have other videos that address the forms of the present subjunctive that you can look at. Now, in terms of use, I'll just show you some examples, right? First, quiero que tú bailes en el festival. I want you to dance in the festival. ¿Tú esperas que Raúl venda su coche? ¿Esperas que Raúl venda su coche? Do you expect Raúl to sell his car? Ellos necesitan que nosotros lo decidamos pronto. Ellos necesitan que nosotros lo decidamos pronto. And I've underlined the verb in the subjunctive. They need us to decide on it soon. Es importante que tú comprendas esto. Es importante que tú comprendas esto. So again, whereas the indicative would be comprendes, ¿me comprendes? The subjunctive is comprendas. Es importante que comprendas esto. It is important that you understand this. So just quickly, at least in the first three examples, we can see sort of a structural thing that pertains to the subjunctive. We have sentences that are complex, that have two clauses, a main clause and a dependent clause. The verb in the main clause, quiero, esperas, necesitan, es, right, is in the present tense, but it's a type of verb, or it's in a type of clause that requires that the verb in the next clause be in the subjunctive. And since that verb is in the present tense, the subjunctive is going to be the present subjunctive. On to the past subjunctive, which some people call the imperfect subjunctive. We can see the forms here. You can see the stem. You can also see the endings. Notice that the endings for the ER and IR past subjunctive forms are the same, but we have different endings for the AR verbs. Probably used to that by now. Notice also that there are alternate endings. So instead of saying hablara, hablaras, hablara, in some places some speakers will say hablase, hablases, hablase, hablásemos, or comiese, comieses, comiésemos, instead of comiera, comieras, comiera. Again, the same types of rules for stress and accents apply here. We're only stressing usually the second to last syllable. Hablara, comiera, viviera, comieran, vivieran, hablaran, unless the vowel has a written accent. Comiéramos, viviéramos, habláramos, hablásemos, etc. So notice where those stresses fall. Now, in terms of usage, we're going to look at some examples of the past subjunctive. Okay. First, yo quería que tú bailaras en el festival. What I've taken is just some of those examples from the previous slide on the present subjunctive, put them in the past. Yo quería que tú bailaras en el festival. I wanted you to dance in the festival. ¿Tú esperabas que Raúl vendiera su coche? Did you expect Raúl to sell his car? Not do you, but did you? ¿Tú esperabas que Raúl vendiera su coche? Ellos necesitaban que nosotros lo decidiéramos rápidamente. Necesitaban que nosotros lo decidiéramos rápidamente. They needed us to decide on it quickly. Era importante instead of es importante. Era importante que tú comprendieras eso. It was important. It was important for you to understand that. So what we can see is our verb in the main clause now is not in the present, but is in a past tense, in these cases in the imperfect, right? And so that means that our verb in the dependent clause, which needs to be in the subjunctive because of the type of meaning being communicated here, has to be in the past or imperfect subjunctive as well. It's just that idea of parallelism. What we're looking at now is the first of the compound perfect tenses, that group of tenses that combines a conjugated form of the auxiliary verb haber, notice I don't pronounce the H, haber, and the ado or ido past participle forms depending on whether it's an AR or ER-IR verb. These tenses are used when we want to emphasize that an action in the past was completed relative to another point in time. With this tense and the rest of the perfect tenses I'll be presenting on the next few slides, the verb haber is conjugated to reflect the time frame we want to refer to, and so that's what determines the names of the tenses. So for example, on this slide we see we're talking about the present perfect. That's because haber is conjugated in the present. For the past perfect, haber is conjugated in the past. Future perfect conjugates haber in the future, etc. Okay. The conjugated form of haber then is paired with the past participle form of the main verb, which is the same as you can see from this slide, right? We have hablado all the way down from yo to ellos, comido, vivido, run all the way down the subject position line vertically. Now you're definitely going to want to commit all of the forms of haber to memory, especially those on this side and on the side for the past perfect tense, because these two tenses, present and past perfect, are fairly common in Spanish, if not very common, just as common as they are in English. In fact, with the perfect tenses, they're pretty easy. I find they're easy. Students find they're easy because their usage tends to parallel usage in English. All right, so let's take a look at this particular tense here, the present perfect. You can see that we have the present indicative forms of haber, has, ha, hemos, habéis, han, without pronouncing the H at all, and then the past participle forms, hablado, comido, vivido. How about uses on the next slide? ¿Has estudiado este material? Have you studied this material? The sense is, have you already studied? Have you studied this material yet? Have you studied it before, right? ¿Has estudiado este material? Or, mis padres todavía no han comido. Mis padres todavía no han comido. My parents haven't or have not eaten yet. El acusado no ha admitido su papel en el crimen. El acusado no ha admitido su papel en el crimen. He has not, the defendant has not admitted his role in the crime. So we're using the present perfect to express the idea that an action either has or has not, or people have or have not done something relative to, in the past, relative to the current moment, right? Have you done something yet? No, I have not done that yet. We use this all the time in English, and the parallel with English usage is pretty much perfect in Spanish. These then are the forms for the past perfect, sometimes called the pluperfect in Spanish. What we're doing is we're conjugating the auxiliary verb haber in the imperfect. In this tense, it happens to be regular. Había, habías, había, habíamos, habíais, habían. And then combining that with our same past perfect hado, ido forms. Now in terms of usage, let's look at these examples. Yo no había hablado con ella antes. I had not spoken with her previously. Ellos habían escondido la cantidad de dinero que gastaron. They had concealed the amount of money they spent. ¿Por qué no me dijiste que habías vivido en Nueva York? ¿Por qué no me dijiste que habías vivido en Nueva York? Why didn't you tell me that you had lived in New York? So we're using the past perfect or pluperfect, right, generally to express that someone had done something prior to another moment that's also in the past. Now here's the future perfect. One thing to point out is that the future tense or the future conjugations of the verb haber have an irregular stem. So we have habré, habrás, habrá, habremos, habréis, and habrán. Okay? Take those irregular future auxiliary forms for haber and add our past participle hado, ido forms. How about when do we use the future perfect? Well, this is not difficult at all. Obviously, the future perfect is used to say that someone will have done something. Not super common, but it does come up every once in a while. You'll see from the examples. Dentro de 5 años, habremos olvidado este episodio. Within 5 years, we will have forgotten this episode. Or, el señor Guzmán habrá reconocido el problema antes de la próxima reunión. Mr. Guzmán will have recognized the problem before the next meeting. Para el próximo verano, los precios de la gasolina habrán subido de nuevo. Para el próximo verano, los precios de la gasolina habrán subido de nuevo. So by next summer, some point in the future, what will have happened? Gasoline prices will have gone up again. I promise it. Now there is of course also a conditional perfect where we talk about what people would have done. Notice that when we conjugate haber, our auxiliary verb, we're conjugating that in the conditional, and that it has the same irregular stem as the future perfect. Habría, habrías, habría, habríamos, habríais, habrían, and we're adding, of course, our past participle forms, hado, ido forms. Now, in terms of usage, let's look at these examples of what people would have done. Yo habría usado otros colores. Yo habría usado otros colores. I would have used other colors. Tú habrías comido en McDonald's. You would have eaten at McDonald's. ¿Qué habríamos recibido a cambio? ¿Qué habríamos recibido a cambio? What would we have received in exchange? Ella habría comprado el vestido si hubiera tenido su tarjeta. Ella habría comprado el vestido. She would have bought the dress if she had had her credit card. So we're using the conditional perfect habría, habrías, etc., plus the past participle to say what someone would have done. Okay, would have done. Now, the very last example you can tell is kind of a tricky one. What we have here is a complex if-then statement, right, about the past, where the if is false, contrary to fact, right? So she didn't have her credit card, but she would have bought the dress. We're using the conditional perfect for the then clause, the would have clause, right? The if clause, if she had had her credit card, is actually the, we'll get to it in a second, but it's the past perfect subjunctive. This slide shows the forms for the present perfect subjunctive, in which we're taking the auxiliary verb haber, using its present subjunctive forms, haya, hayas, haya, hayamos, hayáis, and hayan, in conjunction with the, of course, past participle hado, ido forms. Don't want to go into a long explanation about when this tense is used, but let's look at some examples. María espera que Juan haya mandado el paquete. María hopes that Juan has sent the package. Ellos esperan que nosotros hayamos entendido las reglas. They hope that we have understood the rules. They hope, right now, that we have already understood the rules. Dudo que alguna vez hayas corrido un maratón. Dudo que alguna vez hayas corrido un maratón. I doubt, right now, that you have ever, in the past, run a marathon. So here we have our main clause verb in the present, but our verb in the next clause, the dependent clause, which has to be in the subjunctive because of the type of meaning we're communicating, is actually in the present perfect because it is supposed to have happened already. These are the forms of the past perfect subjunctive in Spanish. We have our auxiliary verb haber conjugated in the imperfect or past subjunctive. Hubiera, hubieras, hubiera, hubiéramos, hubierais, hubieran. But remember that there were alternate forms for the imperfect or past subjunctive, the ones that ended in iese, ieses. So those also apply to the past subjunctive of haber. Some people will say hubiese, hubiésemos hablado, hubiésemos comido, hubiesen vivido, etc. So we take the past subjunctive form of haber, use that in conjunction with the past participle hado or ido forms. When do we do that? Well, here are some examples. María esperaba que Juan no hubiera mandado el paquete. Esperaba que Juan no hubiera mandado el paquete. María hoped that Juan had not sent the package. Ellos esperaban que nosotros hubiéramos entendido las reglas. Esperaban que nosotros hubiéramos entendido las reglas. So they hoped, María hoped, they hoped that we had understood the rules. María hoped that Juan had not sent the package. In both cases, the hoping is in the past, but the other action, not sending the package and having not understood the rules, or having understood the rules, is even further back in the past, okay? Let's look at the last two examples. Yo dudaba que alguna vez hubieras corrido un maratón, or hubieses corrido un maratón. I doubted that you had ever run a marathon. So my doubting is already in the past. I doubted, but I'm doubting something that would have occurred even further in the past. Dudaba que alguna vez hubieras corrido un maratón. Then finally, another example of a complex if-then about the past where the if clause is false, contrary to fact never happened. Si hubieras bailado, habrías ganado el premio. We just saw a similar example with a conditional perfect. Here we have our if clause in the past perfect subjunctive, si hubieras bailado, and then our then clause in the conditional perfect. Habrías ganado el premio. And that's how they work. I tell my students sentences like this last one are sort of the pinnacle, the top of the Spanish verb mountain. It doesn't get any more difficult than this, which is not to say that it's the most difficult aspect of Spanish grammar. All right, so finally we've gotten to the compound tenses known as the progressive tenses, that final column on that first chart I showed you, the overview of the tenses. These tenses are used when we want to emphasize that an action was in progress or is in progress at a certain point in time. As this slide illustrates, right, the progressive tense forms are generated by conjugating the auxiliary verb estar, not haber, but estar, to reflect the time frame we want to refer to, past, present, future, and then combining that form of estar with the present participle or the progressive forms. Those are the ones that end in ando or yendo, okay? And those forms, hablando, comiendo, viviendo, or whatever, those remain the same for all of the subject positions. Now, like the perfect tenses we just saw, the usage of these progressive tenses in Spanish tends to correlate pretty closely to those of their English counterparts. So let's talk about really quickly this slide, the present progressive. Okay, you can see here that we're conjugating the verb estar in the present tense. Estoy, estás, está, estamos, estáis, están, and then we would use that in conjunction with the present participle, sort of the equivalent of the ing forms, hablando, comiendo, viviendo. Let's look at some examples, some really simple examples. Estoy llamando a un amigo. I'm calling a friend. The implication is right now. Estoy llamando a un amigo. What are you drinking? ¿Qué estás bebiendo? ¿Qué estás bebiendo? Right? And then finally, you guys are deciding everything too quickly. You're deciding everything. You are deciding. Estáis decidiendo todo demasiado rápido. So again, we're using this tense, right, the present progressive, to say what someone is doing right now, to emphasize the idea that the action is happening right now. Now here's the final tense we're going to consider, although it's not the only or the last of the progressive tenses we could use. Here we have the imperfect progressive, meaning we're taking the auxiliary verb estar, conjugating that in the imperfect. Estaba, estabas, estaba, estábamos, estabais, estaban, okay? And then we're using that in conjunction with the present participle or progressive forms, hablando, comiendo, viviendo, or whatever that form would be for the verb we want to use, okay? When do we use this? Let's look at some examples again to illustrate. Have 4 straightforward examples here. I was painting the walls. Yo estaba pintando las paredes. Estaba pintando las paredes. She was helping me, right? Ella me estaba ayudando. Ella me estaba ayudando. Were you eating when I called you? ¿Estabas comiendo cuando te llamé? Here at the end we have a preterite form. ¿Estabas comiendo cuando te llamé? Were you eating when I called you? It was late and everyone was leaving, was in the process of leaving. Todos estaban saliendo. Era tarde y todos estaban saliendo. So again, this just emphasizes that something was happening, the idea that the action was happening, and it's a past action, okay? A lot of the times when you want to use the imperfect progressive, when you're thinking in your mind, I was doing something, she was doing something, we were doing something, in Spanish you can actually just use the simple imperfect. So we could rephrase these, right? Yo pintaba las paredes. Ella me ayudaba. We could, but we don't have to.